It was Saturday morning. The clock in my car read 9:58 a.m. when I pulled into a parking spot at the far end of the lot for lock-it-up self-storage. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was thick and humid, the kind of late summer stillness that promises a thunderstorm later. I poured a cup of coffee from my thermos, the steam ghosting against the inside of my windshield. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the small crowd gathered near the B block of units. There were maybe 20 people, the usual mix you see at these things. Hopeful treasure hunters, scrappy resellers, and a few who just seemed to be there for the grim theater of it all. At the head of the crowd, standing next to a harried-looking auctioneer with a clipboard, was Brenda Fairchild. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that was too warm for the weather, an outfit chosen not for comfort but for the performance of authority. She was the president of our homeowners association, a title she wore like a crown. She was addressing the small assembly, her voice carrying across the asphalt. It was a practiced speech, full of phrases like upholding community standards and the unfortunate necessity of fiscal responsibility. She gestured with a perfectly manicured hand towards a roll-up metal door, its corrugated surface catching the morning sun. Unit B17. My unit. I took a slow sip of coffee. It was black, little bitter, just the way I like it. I could hear snippets of her conversation as a man in a greasy baseball cap asked her what was inside. "Oh, who knows?" she said with a dismissive wave. The delinquent owner was an old man. Ita's probably full of worthless junk, old furniture, dusty boxes. But the lien is valid, and the association has a duty to its members to collect what is owed. Ita's just business. She had no idea. She had no idea what was in that unit, and she had no idea what business really was. Our eyes met across the parking lot. I was half hidden by the glare on my windshield, but she found me. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and is taking a moment to savor the kill. She thought this was the end of a long and tedious hunt. She thought I was here to watch, helpless, as my life was sold off for pennies on the dollar. I didn't smile back. I didn't scowl. I simply held her gaze and took another sip of my coffee. I let the warmth of the ceramic mug seep into my hands. The auctioneer cleared his throat, ready to begin the proceedings. He held up a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. Brenda nodded at him, a silent command to proceed. He was about to cut the lock, my lock, a heavy brass model that my wife Eleanor had bought for me years ago. Brenda thought that lock was the only thing standing between her and her victory. She had no idea that the lock she was about to cut was the only thing standing between her and federal prison, and she had no idea that I had the key to both. Wycan? But before I tell you what I did, before I explain the precise and methodical sequence of events that unfolded in the next 10 minutes, I should probably explain how we got here. Edis, a story about rules. Not the loud, arbitrary rules that people like Brenda Fairchild invent to feel powerful, but the quiet, relentless rules that are written down in ink on heavy paper, filed away in county courthouses and records offices. The rules that are bound by precedent and law. The rules that, if you know where to look and have the patience to read them, are the bedrock of everything. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 72 years old. For 45 of those years, I was a civil engineer. My specialty was municipal water systems. But that was a deceptively simple title. It meant I spent my life dealing with contracts, easements, land surveys, state regulations, federal environmental protections, and billion-dollar bond measures. My job was to read the fine print, Hasseper. My job was to understand, with absolute certainty, who owned what rights they had, and where the lines were drawn, both on the ground and on paper. A misplaced decimal point in a flow calculation could flood a town. A misread easement could halt a multi-million-dollar project for a decade. I learned early that details weren't just important, they were the only thing that was real. Everything else was just talk. I'm a widower. My wife, Eleanor, passed away. 6 years ago, she was the opposite of me in many ways. Where I saw the world in blueprints and legal descriptions, she saw it in color and light. She was a painter. She filled our house with life, with friends, with canvases that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine. I was the foundation, she was the beautiful sprawling house built upon it. When she died, the silence she left behind was immense. I found my comfort in the familiar, in order, in routine. I kept the house just as she'd left it. I tended her garden. I lived a quiet, solitary life, and I was content with that. I bothered no one, and I expected the same in return. We moved into the Northwood Hills subdivision 30 years ago. It was a nice, quiet community. The HOA was mostly a formality, a mechanism for maintaining the small park at the entrance and ensuring nobody painted their house an offensive color. It was run by volunteers, decent people who understood they were neighbors first, and board members second. Then, 2 years ago, Brenda Fairchild was elected president. Brenda was a former real estate agent who had moved into the neighborhood about 5 years prior. She had a certain kind of aggressive charm that appealed to a vocal minority. She ran on a platform of protecting our property values and enforcing the covenants, which were, in her hands, euphemisms for bullying and intimidation. The old reasonable board members were shouted down or simply quit, tired of the constant drama. Brenda consolidated power quickly, installing her acolytes in the other board positions. The HOA, once a benign presence, became a predatory one. The notices started appearing on doors. Fines for things that had never been an issue before. Mr. Henderson, 3 doors down, was fined $200 because his prize-winning roses had supposedly grown an inch over the sidewalk. The Miller family was cited for having a child's plastic slide in their backyard that was visible from the street. The violations were petty, the enforcement draconian. Brenda held the monthly meetings like a queen holding court, reading out lists of infractions and gloating about the fines collected. She created an atmosphere of fear. Neighbors who had been friends for decades began to look at each other with suspicion, wondering who would be the next target. My first direct interaction with her was over my lawn. I received a certified letter informing me I was being fined $50 for excessive irrigation leading to sidewalk water staining. As a man who had designed the drainage and irrigation systems for entire cities, the accusation was professionally insulting. My sprinklers were calibrated to the millimeter. The stain was a temporary dark patch of concrete from the morning dew. It was absurd. My first instinct was to fight it, to write a detailed, 10-page rebuttal, complete with hydrological data and photographs. But then, I stopped. I looked at the notice, at Brenda's flourishing signature at the bottom. This wasn't about water, it was about power. An argument would be pointless. Arguing with someone like Brenda is like trying to reason with a hailstorm. You just get battered. So I did something else. I wrote a check for $50. I made a high-quality photocopy of the check and the violation notice. I put the originals in a stamped envelope and mailed them. Then I took the photocopies, stapled them together, and wrote the date on the top. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one I hadn't used much since I retired. I took out a fresh manila folder. With my old drafting pen, in neat block letters, I wrote on the tab, Fairchild, Brenda. I placed the stapled papers inside and closed the drawer. I kept the receipt. That was the beginning of what I came to call the Fairchild file, and the subject of the current dispute. The one that led to the auction was a small shed in my backyard. It is a simple but well-built structure, about 10 feet by 12 feet, where I keep my garden tools and some of my old surveying equipment. I built it myself 20 years ago. I had pulled the proper permits from the county, submitted the plans to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee at the time, and received the written approval. It was, in the parlance of my old profession, fully and legally compliant. 6 months ago, I received another certified letter. This one informed me that my unapproved auxiliary structure was in violation of HOA covenants and that I was being fined $100 per day until it was removed. Attached was a grainy photograph of my shed taken from the street with a telephoto lens, like evidence from a crime scene. This was a different level of attack. This wasn't a $50 fine for a wet sidewalk. This was a demand to dismantle a part of my home, a structure that held memories and was older than Brenda's residency in the state, let alone the neighborhood. This was a line. My first step was procedural. I went to my records, to the metal file box where Eleanor had meticulously kept every important document related to the house. I found the original folder from 20 years ago. Inside, perfectly preserved, was the county building permit, stamped and signed. Beside, it was the letter from the Northwood Hills HOA Architectural Review Committee, on their old letterhead, explicitly approving the shed's design and location. On paper, my position was unassailable. I drafted a polite but firm letter to Brenda and the HOA board. I explained the history of the structure. I included certified copies of the permit and the original approval letter. I pointed to the specific clause in the HOA bylaw Article 7ii, Section 2, which grandfathered in any and all structures approved by previous boards. I sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. I wanted a signature proving she had received it. The signed green receipt card came back to my mailbox a few days later. Brenda had received my letter. Her response came a week after that, the form of another official notice. The daily fine had been increased to $200, and a legal review fee of $500 had been added. The notice stated that prior board approvals found to be in conflict with current community standards are considered null and void. This was, of course, legal nonsense. Contracts and approvals don't just expire because a new person with new opinions takes charge. But it was a clear statement of her position. The facts didn't matter. The documents didn't matter. Only her will mattered. I photocopied the new notice, the certified mail receipt, and my original letter. I placed them all neatly behind the first entry in the Fairchild file. The file was getting thicker. It was at this point that I realized I was not dealing with a rational actor. I was dealing with a tyrant who believed her own pronouncements constituted law. A direct confrontation would be futile. This problem couldn't be solved by arguing across a fence. It had to be solved the way I solved the most complex engineering disputes of my career, with overwhelming, meticulously organized documentation. It was time to get to work. I retreated to my home office. For years it had been mostly a library, a quiet place to read. Now it became a command center. I cleared my old drafting table and set up my computer and a scanner. I called Maria, a woman who had been my paralegal for the last 15 years of my career. She was retired now too, but her mind was as sharp as a tack, and her knowledge of public records was encyclopedic. I explained the situation to her. I heard her sigh on the other end of the line. "Art," she said, "I swear, these little tin-pot dictators are worse than the corporate lawyers we used to deal with. What do you need?" "I need everything, Maria," I said. "I want the HOA's Articles of Incorporation. I want their full financials for the last 5 years. I want the minutes from every board meeting since she took office. And I want you to run a full background check on Brenda Fairchild. Professionally, financially, the works. I feel like I am looking at the tip of an iceberg. "Consider it done," she said. "Just try not to get into any shouting matches with her in the meantime. Let the paper do the talking." While Maria started her deep dive, I began my own work. The fines continued to accumulate. The notices became more threatening, mentioning liens and foreclosure. I didn't respond to them. I simply filed them. Each one was another exhibit. Then came the letter, about my storage unit. It was the most audacious move yet. The letter, drafted by an attorney I later discovered, was a personal friend of Brenda's working out of a strip mall, claimed that since I was delinquent on my HOA due, the fraudulent Financial Association had the right to place a lien on my personal assets. It specifically named my unit at Lock It Up Self-Storage. It claimed they had a court order to seize the contents and auction them off to satisfy the debt. This was a profound violation. That storage unit, it wasn't just a place for old junk. After Eleanor died, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of her studio. Her easel still stands in the spare bedroom, a half-finished canvas on it. But her completed works, her journals, her sketchbooks, all the physical evidence of her brilliant, vibrant life. I couldn't look at it every day, it was too much. So I had carefully packed it all. I wrapped each painting in craft paper, organized every journal by date, and placed them in archival quality boxes. I rented the climate-controlled unit at Lock It Up to keep them safe. It was my vault of memories. It was in a very real sense the last tangible piece of my wife. The idea of Brenda's grubby, grasping hands on those things, of her selling them off to strangers. It filled me with a cold, quiet rage I hadn't felt in years. But rage is an inefficient fuel. It burns hot and fast and leaves you with nothing. Focus is better. My rage became a lens, clarifying my purpose. I took the letter about the storage unit and scanned it. I emailed it to Maria. Purist, A. Her reply came back in less than an hour. Art, this is insane. An HOA can place a lien on the property itself, the house. They can't just go after your personal property, willy-nilly, especially not properties stored off-site. That's not how lien laws work. And that court order she mentions, I'd bet my pension it's fake. She was right. The next morning, I drove down to the storage facility. The manager was a young man, barely out of his teens, who looked permanently overwhelmed. I explained who I was and asked to see the paperwork the HOA had filed against my unit. He was hesitant, but my lease agreement was in order, and I was polite. He finally produced a file. Inside was a copy of a writ of execution from the county court. It looked official at first glance. It had a case number, a judge's name, and a stamped seal. I took a photo of it with my phone. I thanked the manager and left. Back in my car, I zoomed in on the photo. The judge's signature looked blurry, pixelated. The font used for the case number was slightly different from the font used for the rest of the text. It looked like a clumsy forgery. Something put together by an amateur, with a pirated copy of Photoshop. I sent the photo to Maria. She called me back immediately. "I'm in the county court's online portal right now," she said, her voice tight. "The case number doesn't exist. There is no record of any legal action filed by the Northwood Hills HOA against Arthur Pendleton, and the judge, whose name is on this. Judge Albright? She retired 2 years ago and moved to Florida." This was the turning point. This was no longer a case of an overzealous HOA president misinterpreting the bylaws. This was felony fraud. Uttering a forged instrument. Brenda Fairchild had crossed a line from petty tyranny into serious criminality. She had no idea how much danger she was in. I kept the receipts. I now had the receipt for her downfall. Maria's full report came in a few days later. It was a bombshell. A beautifully organized, multi-tabbed spreadsheet of malfeasance. Brenda had a history. She had lost her real estate license 5 years earlier for forging a client's signature on mortgage documents. She had declared bankruptcy twice. The financials for the HOA were even worse than I had imagined. Maria had found the LLC I had noticed, Fairchild Consulting Group. It was, as I suspected, a shell company registered to Brenda. Over the past 2 years, she had paid her own company over $80,000 from the HOA's reserve funds for administrative services, legal consulting, and covenant compliance audits. She was systematically looting. The association, the fines she was levying on residents, weren't to maintain the neighborhood, they were to cover the holes in the budget she herself was creating. And the most recent bank statements showed her own HOA dues were 3 months past due. The hypocrisy was staggering. But the true bombshell, the piece of evidence that would prove to be the linchpin of my entire case, came from my own files, though I didn't know it at the time. It was related to Eleanor. When we first moved to Northwood Hills, the developer was still finishing the last phase of construction. Eleanor, with her artist's eye and her fierce sense of community, had volunteered for the very first architectural review committee. She, along with the developer and a few other early residents, had helped draft some of the foundational documents, the original covenants and restrictions that all subsequent bylaws were based on. She had kept copies of everything. She was meticulous in that way. When she died, I packed all of her old community files into a box and put them in the storage unit along with her paintings. I had not looked at them since. Something Maria said about the HOA's articles of incorporation sparked a memory. She mentioned that the current bylaws on file with the state seemed incomplete, referencing appendices that weren't attached. I remembered a large, leather-bound book Eleanor used to keep on her desk, the Developer's Bible, she'd called it. I knew I had to get into that unit. But Brenda's fraudulent notice had set a date for the auction. Saturday, the 14th of September. This was a Thursday. I had less than 48 hours. My first step was to try the direct approach. I drove back to the storage facility, this time with a folder in my hand. It contained my lease agreement, my driver's license, and a printout from the court's website showing the case number on her writ was invalid. The young manager was even more nervous this time. He looked at my documents, then at the file Brenda had given him. I don't know, Mr. Pendleton, he stammered. The lady, she said she was the president, and she had a court order. The court order is a forgery, I said calmly. You can call the county clerk's office to verify. The case does not exist. You are currently complicit in an attempt to illegally seize my property. I am asking you, as the facility manager, to grant me access to the unit I legally lease. As if on cue, a white luxury SUV pulled into the lot and parked aggressively, taking up 2 spaces. Brenda Fairchild got out. She must have had the manager on a speed dial leash. What is going on here? She demanded, marching towards us. Mr. Pendleton, you are not allowed on this property. You are trespassing. The contents of this unit belong to the association. That is incorrect, Miss Fairchild, I said, my voice even. I am the legal lessee. You are the one who is trespassing. And you are the one who has committed fraud by filing a forged legal document. Her face flushed with anger. The mask of the calm, authoritative president slipped. How dare you? I have had enough of your harassment. She pulled out her phone. I am calling the police. I am going to have you arrested. That would be an excellent idea, I said. I would very much like to speak with them. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 10 minutes later. One was a man in his late 50s, with a calm, weathered face and a name tag that read, S.G.T. Miller. The other was a younger officer, who looked like he was barely shaving. Brenda immediately launched into her performance. Her voice trembled. She wrung her hands. She painted a picture of a poor, beleaguered HOA president trying to do her duty, being harassed and threatened by a disgruntled, delinquent homeowner. She waved her fraudulent court order at them like a holy relic. "Haste trying to intimidate me, officer. Haste trying to break into the unit before the legal auction. You have to stop him." Sergeant Miller listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He took the document from her and examined it. He then turned to me. "Sir, what's your side of the story?" I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her accusations. I simply presented the facts. "Officer, my name is Arthur Pendleton. I am the legal lessee of Unit B-17. This woman, Brenda Fairchild, is attempting to seize my property based on that document, which I have reason to believe is a forgery." I opened the folder I had prepared. "Here is my lease agreement for the unit. Here is my driver's license. The names and addresses match. Here is a printout from the county court's public access website. If you run the case number listed on Miss Fairchild's document, you will see that it returns no record found. The judge listed on it retired 2 years ago. I would like to file a formal complaint against Miss Fairchild for a violation of State Penal Code Section 470, forgery, and Section 472, uttering a forged instrument. I would also appreciate it if you would note in your report that she is attempting to use this fraudulent document to illegally convert my personal property." I handed the folder to Sergeant Miller. Quote, He looked from my neatly organized documents to the flimsy, pixelated paper in his other hand. He looked at Brenda's theatrical, tear-streaked face. Then at my calm, tired one. I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was a man who, like me, had spent a career dealing with people. And he knew the difference between a real victim and a performer. He handed the forgery back to Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying a new weight of officialdom, "at this point, this is a civil matter. We cannot determine ownership here, and we will not be forcing entry for either party." However, he turned his gaze to me. "I have your information, sir, and I will be taking this document number." He gestured to Brenda's paper, "and running it myself with the court clerk on Monday morning to verify your claim. I am filing a report of this incident. I suggest you both leave the property for today and let your lawyers sort it out." Brenda was sputtering, incredulous that her performance had failed. But he's a criminal. The auction is on Saturday." "That is a civil issue, ma'am," Miller repeated, his patience wearing thin. "My advice to you is to make sure your paperwork is 100% in order before that day." He gave me a look that was almost imperceptible, slight nod of the head. It was an acknowledgement, man to man, professional to professional. He knew. The confrontation left Brenda rattled, but it also made her more desperate. That night, a man knocked on my door. It was Mr. Henderson, my neighbor, with the prize-winning roses. He was a small, timid man, a retired accountant, who had been terrorized by Brenda for years. He clutched a baseball cap in his hands, twisting it nervously. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I saw what happened at the storage place. My cousin's son works there," he called me. "I heard you stood up to her." He looked over his shoulder as if expecting Brenda to materialize from the shadows. I might have something that can help." He handed me a small USB flash drive. "I started recording the audio of the HOA meetings on my phone a year ago," he confessed. "She's a bully, and I wanted a record of it, just in case. There's a meeting on here from 3 months ago, Mastago. She goes on a tirade about you and the shed. She says some things. About making an example of you. About how the money from your fines and selling your things would solve the budget problem Shay's been having. It was a gift, a corroborating piece of evidence, capturing her intent in her own words. I thanked him profusely. He just shook his head. "You're the one with the courage, Arthur. We've all been too scared." He scurried back to his house, a fearful ally who had finally found his voice. The next morning, Friday, I received an email. It was from Sarah, the youngest member of the HOA board. She was a lawyer in her 30s, who I suspected had joined the board with good intentions, but had been quickly sidelined by Brenda's autocratic style. Her email was brief and to the point. Mr. Pendleton, I cannot condone the board's actions any longer. The president has refused to share the full financial records with the rest of the board, and she has lied about seeking legal counsel regarding the lien on your property. This is wrong. Attached are the complete bank statements for the HOA's primary and reserve accounts for the last 12 months. I hope they are of some use. I will be tendering my resignation. The bank statements were the final nail in the coffin. They showed everything. The payments to her shell company, the monthly withdrawals from ATMs near casinos in the next state, and most damningly they showed that the HOA's account was nearly empty, while Brenda's own dues were clearly marked as past due 90 days. A coalition was forming, born of shared grievance. I was no longer just one man fighting for his property. I was becoming the focal point for a community that was finally pushing back. Brenda's final desperate act came late Friday afternoon. A sheriff's deputy I didn't recognize served me with an emergency temporary restraining order. It was filled with the most outrageous lies. Then, it claimed I was stalking her, that I had threatened her with violence, that she was in fear for her life. It was a transparent, last-ditch attempt to legally bar me from attending the auction the next morning. She was trying to win by default, by ensuring her opponent couldn't even show up to the field of battle. It was a classic move of a cornered animal, and it was a fatal mistake. By signing that sworn declaration, full of provable lies, she had just committed perjury. I photocopied the order and placed it on the top of the growing stack of papers in the Fairchild file. I called my lawyer David Davies. Davies was a man I had worked with on complex contract litigation for years. He was semi-retired, but he loved a good fight, especially when the other side was an arrogant bully. I'd been keeping him apprised of the situation, and he'd been quietly advising me in the background. Now, it was time to bring him to the front line. I explained the TRO. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound. Oh, she's a piece of work art, don't you worry about that. A tent under acts obtained under false pretenses will be dissolved by a judge on Monday morning, so fast it'll make her head spin, and it's a gift. But perjury is a lovely charge to add to the list, but it does present a problem for tomorrow. Technically, you can't be within 500 feet of her. What do you suggest? I asked. I suggest, he said, a smile in his voice, that you give me a limited power of attorney to act on your behalf. You can sit in your car across the street, you'll be outside the 500-foot limit, but you'll have a great view of the fireworks. I, on the other hand, will be right in her face. I'll meet you there at 9:45 a.m. And that's how I found myself sitting in my car, sipping coffee, watching the scene unfold. It was 10:01 a.m. The auctioneer, a man named Stan, held up the bolt cutters again. He looked nervously at Brenda. Ma'am? Do we proceed, Brenda? Buoyed by the fact I was seemingly trapped in my car, puffed out her chest. The restraining order keeps him away, the writ gives us the property. Cut the lock. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Stan. The voice was calm, but it cut through the morning air like a razor. David Davies, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, stepped out from behind a large truck. He walked forward with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows he holds all the cards. Brenda's jaw dropped. Who are you? My name is David Davies. I am legal counsel for Mr. Arthur Pendleton, the lawful lessee of this unit, B17, he said, handing the auctioneer his business card. And this auction is an illegal proceeding based on fraudulent documents. Brenda scoffed, recovering quickly. This is just a desperate stalling tactic. I have a court order, and I have a restraining order against your client. You have no standing here. On the contrary, Davy said smoothly. I have this. He held up a document, a limited power of attorney, signed and notarized last night, giving me full authority to act on Mr. Pendleton's behalf in this matter, so I have all the standing I need. As for your court order, his voice hardened. It is a forgery, a fact which Sergeant Miller of the Sheriff's Department is already investigating. He nodded his head towards the patrol car parked at the edge of the lot, where Sergeant Miller was sitting, watching. Brenda followed his gaze, and for the first time a flicker of genuine fear crossed her face. She hadn't seen him arrive. Davies turned his attention to the crowd. For the record, he announced, his voice now a powerful courtroom baritone. My client's claim is that the lien against this unit is invalid, and the writ of execution is a criminal forgery. Any party purchasing or taking possession of the contents of this unit will be knowingly receiving stolen property. You will be named as co-defendants in the civil suit for damages and restitution, and you may be subject to criminal charges. I would advise you all to disperse immediately. The crowd, which had been buzzing with anticipation, now murmured with alarm. People started backing away. The man in the greasy baseball cap who had been so eager earlier was now actively trying to blend into the background. The auctioneer, Stan, looked like he was about to be sick. He dropped the bolt cutters. They clanged loudly on the pavement. This is ridiculous, Brenda shrieked, her composure finally cracking. He owes the association thousands of dollars. The bylaws give me the authority. Do they? A new voice joined the conversation. It was mine. I had gotten out of my car. I was walking slowly toward the group. I stopped a good 20 feet away from Brenda, well outside the bounds of her fraudulent TRO. I was holding a large, old, leather-bound book in my hands. What is that? She snapped. This, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence, is the original founding Book of Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions for the Northwood Hills Development. It was placed in this unit for safekeeping years ago by my late wife, Eleanor Pendleton, who was a member of the original board that drafted these very rules. I opened the book to a page marked with a red ribbon. But for years the HOA has been operating off a condensed, photocopied version of the bylaws. A version that, conveniently, is missing a few key sections. For example, Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B. Shall I read it aloud? I didn't wait for an answer. The association, I read, shall have no right to levy fines or penalties against any pre-existing structures, buildings, or improvements for which prior written approval was granted by the developer or the association's acting architectural review committee at the time of construction. I looked up at her. My shed was approved in writing 20 years ago. The fines you levied against me were invalid from the start. On paper, I continued. Furthermore, the association's power to place liens or other encumbrances as a remedy for delinquent dues shall be strictly limited to the real property and dwelling located within the physical boundaries of the Northwood Hills development. The association shall have no right or authority to encumber, seize, or otherwise attach any personal property, assets, or accounts held by a homeowner outside said physical boundaries. I closed the book. The sound of the heavy cover shutting echoed in the silent lot. In other words, Miss Fairchild, even if the fines had been legitimate, which they were not, you never had the legal authority to touch this storage unit in the first place. On paper, this entire proceeding is not just illegal, it's grand larceny. Brenda stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. Her entire world, the world she had built on bluster and intimidation and her own twisted interpretation of the rules, was crumbling around her. And it was all being dismantled by a few quiet paragraphs in an old dusty book. I looked past her toward the edge of the crowd. Mr. Henderson? "Sarah," I called out, "I believe Sergeant Miller is ready to take your statements now." Out of the crowd stepped the timid accountant and the young lawyer. They walked, not with fear, but with a newfound purpose, straight toward the waiting patrol car. This was the moment. This was the collapse. The sight of her own board member and a neighbor she had long terrorized walking willingly to the police broke something inside of Brenda. The fury, the arrogance, the smug superiority, it all drained away, leaving behind a hollow, desperate shell. Her shoulders slumped. Her carefully constructed mask of authority didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She looked from my face to the lawyer, to the book in my hands, to the backs of her former victims. She said nothing. She didn't scream, or cry, or protest. She just stared, her eyes blank, as she finally, truly understood the depth of her miscalculation. Sergeant Miller got out of his car. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the asphalt. He wasn't hurrying. He didn't need to. He stopped a few feet in front of her. "Brenda Fairchild," he said, his voice formal and devoid of any emotion, "I need you to come with me. We have a few questions for you down at the station, regarding the filing of a forged court document. It wasn't a request." The aftermath was swift and decisive. "We have to—" Brenda, facing an avalanche of evidence, the forged writ, the perjured TRO, the bank statements proving embezzlement, the audio recordings of her own incriminating words, had no choice but to cooperate. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony forgery and 1 count of wire fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in a state penitentiary, suspended to 5 years of probation, on the condition that she pay full restitution to the Northwood Hills HOA and to me for my legal fees. The court placed a lien on her house, the very weapon she had tried to wield against so many others. It was sold at auction 6 months later. The proceeds were enough to replenish the HOA's depleted reserve funds, and to make every resident she had ever improperly fined whole again. Mr. Henderson received a check for over $3,000. He used it to build a small greenhouse for his roses. At an emergency HOA meeting held the week after Brenda's arrest, I presented the original Book of Covenants. Sarah, whose resignation was unanimously rejected, was elected the new HOA president. Her first act was to formally declare all of Brenda's fines and liens null and void. A wave of relief washed over the community. People started talking to each other again. The fear that had poisoned the neighborhood for 2 years finally dissipated. The rules, the real ones, had been restored. A few days later, I went back to the storage unit. This time, I used my own key. The heavy brass lock, the one the auctioneer had almost cut, opened with a satisfying click. I rolled up the metal door. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of old paper and dried oil paint. Sunlight streamed in, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. I spent the afternoon there. I didn't move anything or organize anything. I just sat on an old wooden stool and reacquainted myself with the contents. My old Transit and Level packed away in their heavy wooden cases, boxes of blueprints and site plans from my long career. And, in the back, carefully stacked, were Eleanor's things. I opened one of the boxes. I picked one up, its leather cover soft and worn. I opened it to a random page. Her elegant, looping handwriting filled the paper, describing the color of the sky on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat there for a long time reading my wife's words, surrounded by the quiet, orderly evidence of our lives. I reflected on the whole sordid affair with Brenda Fairchild. It was never about the money. It wasn't even about the shed. It was about the fundamental principle that rules should be a shield for the innocent, not a weapon for the powerful. It was about the quiet, unyielding integrity of the written word, of a signed contract, of a stamped permit. Brenda believed that reality was whatever she could make people believe it was, through force of will and performance. She had forgotten, or perhaps never knew, that the most powerful things in the world are not the loudest voices, but the quietest truths written down on paper. As the sun began to set, I carefully placed the journal back in its box. I stood up and stretched, my old bones aching slightly. I walked to the front of the unit and pulled down the heavy corrugated door. It rolled down with a deep, final rumble. I slid the thick steel bolt into its hasp. In my pocket, I had a brand new lock, a massive chrome-plated disc lock that was supposedly impervious to bolt cutters. I threaded its hardened shackle through the hasp and turned the key. The tumblers fell into place with a solid, definitive chunk. It was the sound of peace, the sound of security, the sound of a line being drawn, a boundary being respected, the sound of order quietly and methodically restored.